The city glowed like it was holding its breath for a miracle. Warm lights hung above the streets, music drifted softly through the air, and laughter moved in waves between strangers who felt, for one night, like family. Yet in the middle of all that warmth, a man sat untouched by it. Daniel Whitmore rested on a wooden bench near the square, his shoulders stiff, his gaze distant. Christmas had arrived again, and with it, the quiet ache he could never escape. A year had passed since his wife's absence turned his world silent. 12 months of meetings, investments, and success that meant nothing when the nights grew cold. Daniel had everything people admired: power, wealth, respect. But none of it followed him home when the lights went out. He had learned that loneliness does not care about status. It settles wherever love once lived. He hadn't planned to be there. He rarely went anywhere anymore. But something had pulled him into the crowd, as if part of him hoped the noise might drown the memories. It didn't. Everywhere he looked, he saw what he no longer had. Couples holding hands. Parents lifting laughing children onto their shoulders. Friends exchanging small gifts that carried big meaning. Daniel lowered his eyes and exhaled slowly. Just another night, he murmured to himself. No tree waited for him at home. No music. No reason to celebrate. Christmas had become something other people lived, not him. Then he noticed a small figure standing a few steps away. A little girl no older than 5, wrapped in a worn coat, staring up at the lights with open wonder. Her eyes shone as if the world had never disappointed her. She looked around, then back at Daniel, as if recognizing something familiar in his silence. Without fear she stepped closer. "Mister," she said softly, "why do you look so sad on a happy night?" Daniel froze. In that single question, spoken without judgment, without expectation, something shifted. He didn't know it yet, but that moment, that small voice, was the beginning of everything changing. Daniel had no answer ready. The little girl's question hung in the air, simple and honest, the kind adults rarely dared to ask one another. He looked at her more closely now. Her shoes were scuffed, her sleeves slightly too long, yet her face carried a calm brightness that felt strangely out of place in the winter cold. She waited patiently, as if she truly believed there had to be a reason he looked the way he did. "I'm just tired," Daniel finally said, surprised by how thin his voice sounded. The girl tilted her head, studying him the way children do, without filters or fear. "My mom gets tired too," she said. "But she still smiles when it's Christmas." Before Daniel could respond, a woman rushed toward them, breathless and pale with worry. "Sophie," she cried, pulling the child into her arms. Relief flooded her face so suddenly it almost brought tears. She turned to Daniel, embarrassment and gratitude mixing in her expression. "I'm so sorry. I looked away for 1 second." "It's all right," Daniel said gently. The word, all right, felt unfamiliar, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. The woman introduced herself as Clara. Her voice carried exhaustion but also strength, the kind that comes from standing back up every time life pushes you down. She apologized again, explaining she worked nearby and had lost track of time. Daniel noticed how tightly she held her daughter's hand, as though the world might steal her away if she loosened her grip. Sophie looked back at Daniel, tugging at her mother's sleeve. "He looks lonely, Mom." Clara's face softened. "Sometimes people are," she said quietly. Daniel felt something stir inside him, an old memory of words once spoken to him by someone he loved. He surprised himself by offering a small smile. "I suppose I am." Sophie's face lit up. "Then you shouldn't be alone today." The words were innocent, yet they landed with unexpected weight. Daniel had spent a year building walls around his heart, convincing himself solitude was easier. But standing there, beneath the lights, with a child who saw him without knowing his name or his wealth, he felt those walls begin to crack. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't step away from the feeling. Clara hesitated, unsure whether to linger or leave. People like Daniel were usually distant, wrapped in their own worlds. Yet something about the way he listened, truly listened, made her pause. Sophie, sensing no danger, smiled up at him again as if they were already friends. "My mom says lights are for sharing," Sophie announced, pointing at the glowing tree behind them. "If you stand too far away, you don't feel warm." Daniel followed her gesture. The tree stood tall, its lights shimmering like quiet promises. He remembered someone once saying something similar long ago in a smaller house with windows full of color. The memory tightened his chest, but it didn't hurt the way it used to. This time it felt gentle. "Would you like to sit for a moment?" Daniel asked, surprising himself. He shifted slightly on the bench, making room. Clara almost refused out of habit, but Sophie had already climbed up beside him, swinging her legs happily. For a brief moment they sat together, three strangers connected by nothing more than a pause in the night. Sophie hummed a tune she barely knew, filling the silence with something light and fragile. Daniel found himself breathing easier. Clara spoke quietly as if afraid to break the moment. She mentioned her long days, the small apartment, the effort it took just to keep going. She didn't complain. She simply explained the way people do when they've learned that strength doesn't need an audience. Daniel listened. Not as a man used to commanding rooms, but as someone who understood loss. He realized how rarely anyone spoke to him without wanting something in return. Clara wanted nothing. Sophie wanted even less, just company. You know, Sophie said suddenly, looking at Daniel with serious eyes, people don't stay broken forever. Daniel almost laughed, then stopped. The truth in her words startled him. He had believed his pain defined him now. That healing was something for other people. The lights flickered softly above them. Daniel felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not sorrow, not joy, but possibility. He didn't know why this meeting mattered. He only knew that when Clara finally stood to leave, he felt the quiet urge to ask them to stay, just a little longer, as if time itself had decided to give him a second chance. Clara checked the time and sighed softly. The night was moving on and responsibility always waited. She thanked Daniel for his kindness and guided Sophie off the bench. Yet as they took a few steps away, Daniel felt a sudden heaviness, the kind that comes when a light flickers and you fear it may go out forever. Wait, he said before he could stop himself. They turned back. Sophie's face brightened instantly as if she had hoped for this. Daniel stood, adjusting his coat, feeling strangely nervous. I don't usually do this, he admitted. But would you like to walk with me for a bit? There's a cafe nearby. Nothing fancy. Just warm. Clara hesitated again. Life had taught her caution. But Sophie squeezed her hand and looked up with quiet certainty. It's cold, Mom? That settled it. Inside the cafe, soft light replaced the sharp winter air. Steam rose from cups, and the scent of fresh bread wrapped around them like a memory. Daniel ordered without thinking, choosing simple things. He watched Sophie carefully stir her drink, treating it like something precious. As they talked, Daniel found himself opening doors he had kept locked. Not with heavy words, but with small truths. He spoke of long nights, of a house that echoed, of mornings that felt empty no matter how full his schedule was. Clara listened without pity. She understood the language of endurance. You kept going, she said gently. That matters. Daniel looked at Sophie, who was drawing shapes on the table with her finger. I forgot how, he replied honestly. Sophie looked up. Then you can remember, she said. People do. Those words followed him long after they left the cafe. At the door, Clara thanked him again, her voice steady but sincere. Sophie waved with both hands. As they disappeared into the crowd, Daniel remained standing there, realizing something quietly powerful. For the first time since his loss, he didn't rush home to silence. Instead, he felt the pull of possibility guiding him forward. The following days passed differently for Daniel, though nothing in his schedule had changed. Meetings still filled his calendar, numbers still moved across screens, and decisions still waited for his approval. Yet something inside him had shifted. The silence that once followed him everywhere felt less heavy, as if it no longer owned every corner of his mind. He caught himself thinking about Sophie's laugh, about the way Clara carried herself with quiet determination. They hadn't asked who he was or what he owned. They had simply seen him. That realization stayed with him longer than any business success ever had. On Christmas morning, Daniel woke before sunrise. For the first time in a year, he didn't remain in bed staring at the ceiling. He stood, walked through the empty halls of his house, and felt the weight of what he had built, and what he had neglected. The house was large, flawless, and lifeless. Without overthinking it, he made a decision. By afternoon, soft lights appeared again in the windows. Nothing extravagant. Just enough to glow. Daniel didn't try to replace what was lost. He honored it by allowing warmth back in. When the doorbell rang later that evening, his heart raced in a way he hadn't felt in years. Clara stood there, surprised. Sophie peeked from behind her coat, eyes widening at the lights behind Daniel. You remembered us, Clara said softly. Daniel nodded. I remembered myself too. Inside, the house felt different, not because of decorations but because of laughter. Sophie explored every room as if it were a storybook. Clara helped in the kitchen without being asked, moving naturally like someone who belonged. As they shared a simple meal, Daniel realized something profound. Healing didn't arrive with grand gestures. It arrived quietly, through connection, through choosing not to be alone when you didn't have to be. That night, for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt grateful, not for what he had gained but for what he was finally willing to open again. When the evening drew to a close, Daniel walked Clara and Sophie to the door, reluctant to let the moment end. The cold waited outside, but inside the house, something warm had taken root. Sophie hugged him without hesitation, her small arms wrapping around him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Don't forget," she said seriously, "lights are for sharing." After they left, Daniel stood alone again, but this time the silence felt different. It no longer pressed against his chest. It rested beside him, calm and gentle. He looked around the house, now glowing softly, and understood what he had missed all along. Love didn't disappear when someone was gone. It changed shape. It waited. In the weeks that followed, Daniel made choices that surprised even himself. He opened his home on weekends not for events or attention, but for connection. Clara continued her work, but no longer alone. Opportunities appeared not as charity but as trust. Sophie became a familiar presence, her laughter echoing through rooms once filled only with quiet. Daniel never tried to replace the past. He honored it by living differently. He learned that strength wasn't found in control but in openness. That purpose didn't come from success but from service. And that sometimes the smallest voices carried the greatest truths. 1 year later, as Christmas returned, Daniel stood by the window watching the lights glow once more. This time he smiled. Not because the pain was gone but because hope had returned. He had expected nothing that first night. But life, through a child's kindness and a mother's courage, had given him everything he truly needed.